Welcome back to our cover hem journey. This is part 2. And before I embark on talking about all sorts of different neck finishes, neck edge finishes with your cover hem, and that also goes for cuffs and hems and things like that as well. But before we get to that, I just want to show you a couple of things at the cover hem machine. So let's move over to there. Okay, so I did mention in part 1 a little bit about stopping and starting with your cover hemming, and I have it threaded up at the moment for 2 thread wide, and I'm just going to do a little section of that. And what I'm going to show you is how there's 2 different ways that you can actually take this out of the machine and not have that problem with tugging on threads because they're really tight. So one way is to turn your flywheel on the right-hand side of the machine once and back up again. Basically, what that does is it unlocks the threads, so you can see how very easy it is to pull it out of the machine now. And so I'm just going to cut the threads. But the disadvantage with this is that sometimes the looper thread on the back will start unraveling. Can you see that? It'll start unraveling, and then that's no good if it leaves you with a section at the front that you actually wanted stitched. All right, so I'm going to show you another way that not only removes the cover hemming from the machine, but it also locks those stitches. So let's just go a short distance down. And then what I do is, before I lift the presser foot lifter, I want to put my tweezers or some other sharpish implement behind those threads. And then I am going to raise the presser foot. And the reason I do this before I raise the presser foot is because I won't be able to get my tweezer in there very easily, because the foot, of course, comes up closer to the needles. Now that I have these 2, it's like a big loop of thread, I'm going to take my scissors and cut that loop. Both of the needle threads got cut. And now what I do is I take the fabric over here with my left hand and I hold it firmly and I give it a tug straight out of the machine. Some people call this the pull out the machine method. All right. All right. Those top threads are gone. They now have been pulled to the back of the work. So there we are. Let's just get that out of the way. Now I have 3 threads at the back. I have my looper thread, and it looks a bit fuzzy and fluffy because I actually have a woolly poly thread in my lower looper. And then I have the 2 threads that came from my needles. And so all threads are at the back. And I'm just going to put this underneath the foot of the machine. And I am going to take my 2 needle threads and my 1 looper thread, and I am going to tie them together if I can see which thread is which. And I'm trying very hard not to bump the camera because it's really quite in my way. All right, so I have now tied 2 little knots in those threads, and I am going to snip those tails off fairly close to my knot. All right, so let's lift this up and bring it closer for you to see my little knots. Okay, there it is. And there is the back of my serging, and there is the front of my serging. All right, it just so happens that I had white thread in the machine, so they don't show up as well as they perhaps could have. And you will also notice something familiar. Do you see that this fabric between these 2 lines of stitching, this is a 2 thread wide, it's lifting a little, almost like a ridge. And that is what we call tunneling. So I was just using this little piece of fabric. It happens to be 2 layers of quilting cotton. So if I pull it apart there, you'll see it's 2 layers of quilting cotton, and I still got tunneling on that fabric. So that's telling you the importance of following those steps that I outlined in part 1 about trying to avoid tunneling. So if I was now going to actually make something with this fabric, I would sit at the machine with a couple of samples of fabric like this, and I would make some of those adjustments that we discussed in part 1, such as lowering the looper tension, making my stitch a little smaller, and so on. All of that is in your notes and in the video of part 1. All right, I wanted to show you something that I didn't really discover until quite recently, and that is the use of this little implement, which has got a rather odd name. It's called a hump jumper. And I did mention it in part 1, and I just want to actually show you how it works now. This hump jumper came with my sewing machine. It doesn't come with all machines, but it is able to be purchased. It doesn't always look exactly the same as this. It may just be like that, a little plastic tool. And the idea is that you put it in the back of the foot to help you over this hump. So I've done a seam in this rather thick fleece. You can see how thick the fleece is. So I did a little seam there, and as you can imagine, this is pretty thick with 3 layers of fleece on this side of the seam. So I'm just going to start stitching, and as I get closer to this hump, now my foot has pretty much hit the hump. What I'm going to do is I am going to raise my presser foot, and I am going to put this hump jumper underneath my foot, and it will only go in a certain distance that will then allow me to still lower the presser foot again. And I like to just take these threads that were at the beginning of my cover hemming and just cut them. So the other thing you need to make sure, and I think I mentioned it on part 1, is that you don't have the needles coming down and hitting this little plastic tool, because then you're going to break your needles and you could break your tool. It's not a good thing. Okay, so now that I've got the hump jumper in there, it has made my foot completely level, and that means that going over this hump is not going to be such a big deal for my machine, and hopefully we will get no skipped stitches. So once I have gone past that, I of course can take the hump jumper out, and I can continue on to the end of my fleece, and I am turning my needles, my flywheel backwards, because then it comes out really easily. And you of course can't really see the stitching of the cover hem terribly well, because the stitches have sunk down into the fleece. But let's have a look at the back. All right, it's not the best that I've ever seen. All right, it managed to go over that seam without any skipped stitches. Something was pulling over here, but as I have pulled the stitches, they actually look a lot better. All right, no skipped stitches anywhere along that section of stitching. And probably what I would do is, if I was making a fleece garment, I would come back now and I would play a little bit with the settings on my computer to get, not my computer, sorry, my cover hem machine. I would play with the settings on that to make sure that the tension and the stitch length and everything was as close to perfect as possible. Right, and I call this the quick folded neckline, and obviously quick folded hems or hem. And this is a top which I made some years ago, and I used gray thread, 2 thread wide in my cover hem, and I also had gray thread in my looper. And all I did to finish off the neckline and the sleeves. This is a long, sort of 3/4, just a little bit longer than 3/4 sleeve. So that was done on the sleeves, and it was done on the bottom of the garment as well. This is the hemline of the garment. And it was one of those high-low tops. So it's a little bit higher at the front than it is at the back. That was really quite popular a while ago. I don't know if it still is. I'm not a slave to fashion, so I kind of tend to wear what suits me to wear. Okay, so what I did in this particular instance was I simply folded the fabric of the neckline over and pressed it. Now, this fabric is a polyester blend knit of some sort. And because it wasn't that thick, I did decide that stay tape was probably going to be my friend. So I showed you that stay tape last time in part 1, and we're going to see it used quite often. Now, it comes in a lot of different thicknesses, and probably this is too wide for the purposes of this. Although, if I was to put that, let's say this is the inside of my fabric, and I was to put that all the way along the edge of my fabric, guaranteed when I turn it over, I have actually got 2 layers of stay tape in there, which is probably why this top has stood the test of time. I probably made this, oh goodness, easily 5 or 6 years ago. And it has not come undone. It has washed and worn well. And that could be because I had 2 layers of stay tape on the neckline. Now, I want to just show you what I do with stay tape when I have got like a round neckline. Obviously, this is not going to want to go around the curve very well. So what I do in that instance is I take my scissors and I give my stay tape a little snip at various intervals, probably depending on the curve, how steep or sharp the curve is. You probably wouldn't need to do it more than about once every 1.5 or so inches. So now I've just turned this inside out, and we're going to pretend that this is the raw edge of my fabric. Okay, and I'm simply going to lay this onto, well, fairly close to the raw edge of my fabric. And do you see that as I go around the curve, these little snips or trims, whatever you want to call them, they splay the stay tape out, and it fits my curve beautifully. And I would simply continue going all the way around the neck, and then this gets fused with an iron onto my fabric. Obviously, at this point, I do need to have one or both of my shoulders sewn in order to do it. I usually will sew both my shoulders. I don't have any problems with what some people call sewing in the round. It doesn't bother me. I'm used to it, the same as setting in sleeves. For the most part now, I will sew the sleeve in, and then I will sew from the bottom of the sleeve all the way up and all the way down my side seam. I tend to do that a lot, but when it comes to necks, I'm okay to do it in the round. So once my stay tape has been ironed all the way around the edge of my top, I then simply turn it over. Now you've got options. You can use your clips. All right, you have to take them out before you reach them. And I would try to make sure that you cover your stay tape. And so if you can't cover your stay tape and it's sticking out beyond the fold of your fabric, and this fold here would be a raw edge. This is obviously a double fold here, but this would be a raw edge. If your stay tape is, let's say, peeping out beyond that, I would make sure that you use a narrower stay tape, or of course, you can always cut your stay tape narrower. All right, and then of course it's going to do double duty. You'll have 2 lengths for the same. But as I say, you can buy it in varying lengths. To my way of thinking, it's all much the same price, whether you buy the 1/2 inch or whether you buy the 1.5 inch. give or take a dollar here or there. So if you buy the wider one, you can just put it on your cutting table and just go chips with your rotary cutter and cut it very easily. I wouldn't sit and try and cut it with a pair of scissors like this. Okay, so now that you have turned it over, you can use clips. Of course, you can use pins as well. And I will get a pin here to show you. You can use the pins as well. If you use pins like that and you are going slowly, you could go over the pin. All right. I generally take the pin out just before I get to it. Would I use the hump jumper on these sleeve seams? Shoulder seams? Yes, I probably would, because I have had far too many times where I've gone all the way around the neckline and then I just sit and I just want to hang my head because my cover hemming skipped on the shoulders. And yes, you can go back and you can repair it and you can go start here and go to there and go over it again, but you always kind of see that, and I always know it's there. So let's do everything we can to avoid our skipped stitches where possible. All right, so this is what I would do now. And now I would go to the machine and I would simply come along here on the right side of the fabric with my 2 rows of stitching. It could be, and I'm going to show you some samples, it could be 2 thread narrow where the needles are closer together, or it could be 2 thread wide like I just showed you on this piece of fabric. Well, let's show you the fleece. On the fleece, it could be 2 thread wide like that. All right, it could be either. It could also be triple cover hem if you want to have 3 little rows of stitching, which sometimes can actually look quite nice. And I'll show you that on some of the tops where we have a ribbing. But this one is just called my quick folded neckline. All right, so let's show you another one. Okay, this is a piece of fabric that I bought when I was in London. I bought it from a street vendor, and I have every intention of going back to see if the street vendor is there when I visit London next month. It is a scuba, and it's got these wide navy and white straps. It is a dress, and I did the same fold over edge. Uh-oh, do you see? There is a nasty skipped stitch. All right, I don't know why it's there, but it's there, and it's very noticeable. I will tell you that I sat for quite a while trying to figure out whether I made my cover hemming white or whether I made it navy. And in the end, I went with navy, and I'm kind of glad I did. On the sleeves, I did the sleeves exactly the same. And this, of course, is 2 thread narrow. And so is it on my sleeves, 2 thread narrow. And you can see where I went over the cover hemming, and there are the threads from my knot. And if I look here, there is no skipped stitches on my sleeve. Well, I guess we need to be grateful for small mercies. Of course, the other sleeve was the same. And then down at the bottom, which my hem is obviously upside down, I did 2 thread narrow again on my hemline. And look at that, no skipped stitches. So I was pretty lucky with everything except this little bit on the neckline. And I chose to do it in navy, and pretty much the only place that the navy stitching shows is on the front of the neckline. On my sleeves and my hem, it doesn't show very much because it's buried in this blue color. All right, so that is 2 thread narrow. All right, this one is, oh, I just totally love this little dress that I made. This one is an ITY knit. All right, very stretchy, very thin. And I actually, on my center front seam, I came by afterwards with my cover hem, and I actually cover hemmed my serged seam down flat. And it really, it sits very well. Yes, I could have probably been a little more accurate to have my, this thread maybe slightly over on this thumb, and then that one slightly nearer to the ditch of my seam. But I'm happy with it. I wear it a lot in summer. It's a little bit above the knee. It's not really a mini, but it's a little bit above the knee, and it is so comfortable and so cool. And you will notice that round the neck and round the armhole, I did 2-thread wide. And you know, it's okay. It's not brilliant, but it's okay. And then my hemline, the same, I did 2-thread wide. Can you see that I had a skipped stitch there? And there is a skipped stitch, so that will have to go onto my mending pile to get fixed. But by and large, I probably have worn this little dress about 50 times. So I'm very happy with it. I did that same cover stitching to hold my seams down on the back. And why have I got so many seams here? Well, it was because I literally had pieces of this fabric left, and I really wanted to make this dress. So I decided to piece pieces of it together so that I had enough for this little dress. I don't know what possessed me, but at some point in time, it must have been price, I got this lovely, rather bold ITY knit, and I made a little dress out of it. But you know what? Every time I put the dress on, I feel like I should be putting a dressing gown on top of it. It kind of screams pajamas at me. So it's now in my pajama drawer, and I wear it in summer. It's lovely and cool. And it has 2-thread narrow around the armholes and the neck. And all I did was turn it over, and you will see here, there are little bits of my stay tape sticking through. If there's one thing, piece of advice that I can give you in part 2, do not try to do ITY knit, something very thin, on your cover hem without stay tape. It honestly will tunnel, and it will be not nice. It will not look nice at all. So I did definitely use stay tape on that. Incidentally, I use stay tape on my seams as well. All right, so my seams obviously were serged with my serger. And can you see, once again, I really didn't need stay tape that wide. I could quite easily have cut that stay tape in half and just ironed it to half of it to there, and it really wouldn't have stuck out beyond my serging very far. Notice I only have the stay tape on one piece of the fabric. In other words, this is my front and this is my back. I only put it on the front or the back. It doesn't matter which one you do. In fact, this is probably the back. All right. And so I used my stay tape, and I used my stay tape on the hemline as well. And of course, there is my 2-thread stitching. All right, let's whip through the rest because it's all very much the same. There is my 2-thread narrow, folded over my neck, opening, folded over my armholes, pressed with stay tape, and then stitched it with my cover hem. And of course, the same for the hem. And then this one, another one, it was, I don't really like this one terribly much. It's like a polyester knit, and it really doesn't breathe very well. So it's not a very cool dress on a hot summer's day. But again, it's the 2-thread on there, and the sleeves, and the hem. All right, this one again, I don't know, sometimes I'm shopping for fabric and I see something and it appeals to me, and I think to myself, oh, pretty summer dress. And then when I put it on a hot summer's day, I think somebody's going to think I'm wandering around in my nightie. So again, this one tends to end up in my sleepwear drawer. I did 2-thread wide on the armholes and the neckline, and it's lying fairly well on the neckline, but it has tunneled a bit on the sleeves. And I'm wondering, nope, there is stay tape there, but maybe 2-thread narrow would have been a better thing for a soft, thin ITY knit. So bear that in mind. If your fabric is very thin and soft, a 2-thread is probably a better option. All right, unless you double stay tape. There, of course, is my hem with 2-thread wide. And then this one also was the fold over. This was a project that we did with Jennifer Tryon. And I'm not even going to waste too much time showing it to you because you really can't see it terribly well. It's black thread on black, but that was again another folded over edge. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we are going to do ribbed necklines. Oh, and by the way, before we move on, I will put photographs of some of those folded edges in your notes, just to remind you of that. It's so simple and so easy. I'm not actually going to demonstrate it at the machine. You can decide where to place your stitches, but generally I will fold over enough fabric that, let's say if this is my stay tape, all right, and I have ironed it onto my fabric, I will fold over my fabric and then I will stitch my cover stitching along here. So I'll probably use the width of the foot on my cover hem machine as my guide for the folded edge of the fabric over here. Or you could look at your cover hem machine and you could maybe ride that folded edge of your armhole or neckline or hem along that needle plate if you wanted it slightly wider. Sometimes I have made a very narrow little turnover and I've had to sew quite close to my folded edge. Okay, let's move the camera back so you can see. I've got quite a narrow fold over. It might be that I was short on fabric, didn't want to make my armholes gape wide, so I didn't want to cut them down or fold them over too far. So then on something narrow like this, I might have to sew fairly close to my folded edge. So this one definitely would be a better one for 2-thread narrow, because then I at least would have a little bit of fabric that, you know, with a stitching not right close to the edge. Okay, so there you go. Quick folded necklines. Let's move on to ribbed necklines, cuffs, and hems, and I will meet you back shortly. Okay, so let's talk about ribbed necklines. This fabric is not actually ribbing. It is a soft jersey, bamboo jersey knit. And I made a nightgown from this fabric. I really just love these little seahorses. They are upside down. And I did not realize that until after I had made the nightie. But as one of my dear sweet friends said, Liz, when you're in the nightie and you're looking down at the seahorses, they're the right way up, so don't worry about it. Well, I'm not worrying about it because I and my husband are the only ones that see the seahorses upside down anyway. And somebody else said to me, seahorses do swim upside down. In any event, I didn't have enough of this fabric to do the sleeves. So I found a piece of fabric, this jersey, and it just called out to me and said, use me together with the seahorses. So I made the sleeves, and they are, of course, 2-thread wide. And I did a ribbing for my neckline. And I was very happy with this neckline. And what I did was I sewed it on with my sewing machine. All right, sometimes I do that. And then what I did afterwards is I pressed the seam away from the ribbing, and I came by with my cover hem 2-thread wide, and I stitched. And as I went along my join, so let's put it like this here so that you can see, and I'm actually going to take the foot off the machine so that you can see exactly what I'm talking about. I hope you can see here. There are 3 little markings on the foot. Most cover hem machines have got these markings, and they correspond to the needles in the machine. So that's why there are 3. If you have a 2-thread cover hem, you would just have 2 little lines here. So as I am feeding this fabric through the machine, that middle line I guide right over the join between my ribbing and my nightgown. And then the needle on this side and the needle on that side does my stitching of the 2-thread wide. Of course, I could do triple cover hem here, but I would have to be a whole lot accurate that my middle thread fell exactly into that ditch, because if it slipped out of that ditch, it would be very noticeable. Okay, and I do believe that I stitched this in white, which is fine. And that was done a little while ago, but I really do love this nightie. And of course, my hemline was done with Coverhemming as well. So at this point, you might ask me, so why do you use Coverhemming on your hemlines? You could just as easily do a straight stitch on your sewing machine or a zigzag on your sewing machine. Sure, I could, but I do like the Coverhemming because it gives you quite a bit of elasticity. If I was to have done that with a straight stitch from my sewing machine, it probably would have gone and popped. And then I would have had a break in my hem. All right. And obviously, whoops, do you see? It's time for mending. All right. Some of the stitching has come undone, and I am going to do that. I also want to tell you at this point that I have been playing a lot while I've been preparing for this class. I have been playing a lot with some of the threads in my drawer that I almost forgot that I had. And this I've had forever and ever. It is a poly, I don't know whether it's a woolly poly or a woolly nylon, one of those ones. And if you push it together, if you sort of hold it together, let's see if I can do that. All right. Do you see? It looks kind of fluffy. It's not like a regular thread. And if I do that, maybe it makes it look even more fluffy. Yes. Do you see? It makes it look even more fluffy. And if you put that in your looper, what happens is as it goes through the machine, it stretches out tight because of the tension of the machine. And then when it is sewn onto your garment, it relaxes and that thread sort of pluffs out a little bit or plumps out a little bit. And so you get slightly better coverage on the inside of your hem. I have found that I am getting less skipped stitches when I use this kind of floss thread in my looper. This here was done a while back, as I said, and I used a regular serger thread in my looper. And this is when I find quite often I get skipped stitches. And then when it gets left, of course, like on my hem I just showed you, it comes undone. When that skip stitch comes undone, it starts unraveling. So I am going, before I put this machine away tonight, I am going to redo the hem with this woolly nylon, woolly poly. Madeira has a very nice thread. I used it when I was with Janome. I don't have any left now, but it was called Aero Flock, a Madeira thread, and it's very nice. There are, of course, other brands on the market that you could use. So that's just showing you some of the guides and some of the hints and tips for your binding. Right, let's have a look at another shirt that's got a binding. Last year for Quilt Canada, they asked us, I volunteered, and they asked the volunteers to please wear a white t-shirt when you were doing your volunteering. So I pulled some lovely soft jersey knit. I think this is a blend, it's not a pure cotton, out of my stash, and I made a rather nice little t-shirt with short sleeves because it can be quite warm in Vancouver in June. And today, actually, I ironed this little Canadian flag on it, and I shall wear that when I am in London and South Africa next month. So again, here I did my cover hemming on my sleeves and my hemline. And when it came to the neckline, I did exactly the same as what I just showed you on those on that nightie. I serged my binding, and my binding was made with the same fabric. Now, I'm going to give you a little word of advice, is that when you do your binding, and I only am going to tell you this because you should ask me how I know this. All right. If you measure your neckline opening, that's the front and the back, and you put that measurement together. As I said to you, I usually do my necklines in the round. I don't like that sort of thick thing that you get on one of the shoulders when you join at a shoulder seam and do the shoulder seam later. My preference is not to have that. So I would do my 2 shoulder seams, and then I would measure my neck opening, the whole of it. And the general rule of thumb is that you're going to remove some of that measurement. And I wished I could say to you, well, take 10% off or take 20% off. It doesn't really work like that, because it's going to depend very much on the stretch value of your fabric. If your fabric does not have very much stretch, I would not remove a lot of that. Let's say, for argument's sake, I went around my neckline and it measured 25 inches. And it was something like a lycra spandex or a fairly tight knit that maybe only had 20, 30, 40% stretch. Then my neckline, I would not make it much less than 25, because if you do, it's going to pull and crimp the neckline of your shirt in. And you don't want that. All right. You want your neckline to lay nice and flat. So let's say on that one, maybe I would have made it 23, 23 and a half, maybe even 24 inches. All right. Around. And that's what I would have cut for my binding, whether it was a contrast like my nightie or exactly the same fabric as here. And you're going to cut it double the width you need plus half an inch, because you're going to fold it in half. And that is what, let's get it over here where it's a little bit thinner. That is what you're going to lay on your neckline opening. And you're either going to do a serged stitch, you're going to serge that together, or you're going to do a straight stitch with your sewing machine. Remember that a straight stitch with your sewing machine can pop if you're pulling it over your head and you're stretching the neck opening a bit too much. If your neck opening is sort of like a boat neck or something like that, don't worry too much, because the neck opening is quite big. I don't like boat necks. I like mine to be fairly snug around my neck. And so on this particular fabric, let's say it was 30 inches. I probably reduced that by about 3 or 4 inches on my binding. And the other tip I will give you is that you will notice that my binding here is nice and flat. All right, let's see if you can see it better at my camera. All right, let's focus it. Being white, it's really hard to see. But that neck binding is really flat. And the reason that it's flat is that I did not serge that join in my binding to make a circle of neck binding fabric. I did it with my sewing machine, 1/4 of an inch or so, and then I folded it open and pressed it flat. And that then gives you a nice flat thing. You don't want a big bulge at the back of your neck. It's going to bother you terribly. Okay, so once I now have this sewn on, my preference actually is a straight stitch at the sewing machine. Or better still, at your cover hem, sew your binding to your t-shirt, right sides together. Obviously, this is right side as well on the binding, but your binding wrong sides are inside that fold. I would come along with my chain stitch, because the chain stitch has got a lot more elasticity than my straight stitch at my sewing machine would have. Some people do not have the luxury of some of the things that we've got, like a cover hem. So what I then say to them is, don't do a straight stitch, do a very, very tiny zigzag. So you can set a zigzag to 1 and 1. Stitch length 1, stitch width 1, or 1 1/2, 1 1/2. And then that gives you just the tiniest little zigzag when you're sewing that ribbing or binding to the neckline. And then that makes it not pop the minute you pull it over your head. All right, so once you have sewn that on, you're then going to press it nicely at your ironing board. I like to press it nicely. I use Best Press quite a bit. And I use a press cloth. All right, and I like to use a silk organza press cloth. And if you can't find silk organza, let me know and I'll go hunting for it. You'll see here, it frays something crazy. All right, if I put it there by the black. And what I need to do is, can you notice there, I used my wavy blade on my rotary cutter. I think I need to do another whip around with the zigzag blade on my rotary cutter. Don't turn it over and stitch a seam. All right, let's see if it'll behave. Don't turn it over and stitch a seam, because when you iron that onto your fabric, sometimes it can make a mark or a ridge in your fabric. So rather use a pinking shears or your rotary cutter blade to cut a sort of zigzag edge. All right. And what I do is I normally buy a yard or a meter of the silk organza. It is not inexpensive. don't buy the polyester one. It's got to be the genuine silk organza. It's often found in bridal fabric departments. So if you go to a big fabric store and they have a bridal department, I'm thinking of a store like Fabricana in Vancouver. They have a bridal section and they definitely sell silk organza. Buy yourself a white or an off-white or cream, because then you can actually see through it. So when you come to do your pressing, you can actually see what you're pressing, and it's really very handy. So once you've got your neckline pressed, this is when you are now going to put it through the machine, through your cover hem, and you're going to place your needles equidistant from the ditch of where you're binding joint, exactly what I showed you with the 90 with the seahorses. Okay, so that was that one. And I made another one because obviously I was volunteering for several days in a row in Vancouver. And so I made this one, and this one's much more polyester, but I quite like it. It's got these little circles woven into the knit. And I made a self fabric binding and did it in exactly the same way as I've just been talking about. And that way you get a lovely flat neckline. If you get a neckline and it's like wavy, what I would do is undo it. It's not worth it. You're not going to like it, and it's not going to look good. Undo it all and figure out, was it wavy because this stretched, or was it wavy because that was too short or too long? And then make adjustments to that, and maybe even cut another binding if you need to, and put it into your garment. Okay, I will show you this one now. This one is a very similar concept. All right, this one is a lovely well, not hand dyed, but custom dyed fabric. I just totally love it. And I used the same fabric that I used on my nightie for the sleeves, and I made cuffs with this fabric because I only ordered 1 meter of this fabric and I didn't have enough for the sleeves. Of course, we all know that when you're making a shirt, you need to have twice your body length plus for the sleeves. And of course, 1 meter didn't do that, especially as this comes down quite far. And this folded edge at the bottom, do you see? I folded it over and serged that onto the hem. I quite like a hemline like that on a tunic top. So this is actually quite long. It comes down a good distance beyond my hips. And the reason I do that is because I like wearing this top with leggings. And I don't believe that leggings, and I hope I'm not treading on any toes here, but I don't believe that leggings are pants. Let's just say some people don't look very attractive when they are wearing leggings and they're wearing them as pants. I sometimes see people that do that, and I'm not even talking about the size of people. I just look at them and I think, well, my goodness me, why are you bothering to even wear a pair of pants? Because it leaves nothing to the imagination. All right, so I then did my neck binding, the same fabric as the sleeves, and then I had little pieces left over, which I was then able to use for my 2 cuffs. And I totally love this top. And what I did here was I did it exactly the same way as I've shown you before. And then I used, and I think unfortunately I put it away. I used one of those floss threads in the looper, and you can see my stay tape. This is a French terry fabric, and it's lovely. It's very soft and lovely. And if you want to know where to get floss, I gave you some brand names just now, but I bought this particular floss from Fab Cycle. They had a whole lot of it in a while ago. I don't know if they still have any left, but I chose about 4 or 5 colors that I really liked and knew I would use. And they were big, giant cones that I'll probably have for the rest of my life, because really all you're doing is putting it in your looper. I never, ever put this floss in my needles. It just does not play nicely in needles. So I only use it. So you only need to get 1 spool or 1 cone of the floss if you're going to use it in your looper. Okay, so there is that top. And this one is another one. All right, this one is a very soft, lightweight ponte. And when I ordered it, I didn't realize it was going to be that lightweight. So I had intended it for it to be a pair of pants, but in the end, it ended up being a nightie. And so I added a binding around the neck, and then I did a cover hem there. Now, you will notice that I've got black stay tape, and I have got this here, which some of you may recognize from bra kits. It is a woven tape, which is fusible. And I put that on here because I was concerned that if I came by and did a 2-thread wide next to my neck binding, I didn't want to do it on the neck binding because it's really quite narrow. So I wanted to do it next to it. And I thought, you know what? I need to stabilize that fabric. And I happened to use a woven interfacing there. And it seems to have worked really nicely. All right, so that was just an extra little bit of stabilizing for the neck of my nightie. And I did the same for my sleeve cuffs and the hemline. Well, let's just say I was a very lazy girl when it came to the hemline. I just did a straight stitch and cut away the excess fabric behind. So you know what? The next time I have this blue color out, I think I will just whip through this with a cover hem, a 2-thread narrow cover hem through there. The other thing that I will tell you is there's no reason why you can't do a chain stitch there. If you don't want 2 needles, I could just as easily have done a chain stitch. It's very strong and very durable, and it's got more stretch than a straight stitch from a sewing machine. Okay, one more thing that I want to show you here is what not to do. Let's put it that way. This is another fabric that I got from the same place that I got the one I've just shown you, and I absolutely love this. This one is a bamboo lycra, but in all honesty, I don't think that the lycra content of this is very high because it has stretched quite a lot. And I am sort of a bit guilty because I didn't put stay tape on. I thought, oh, lycra, it'll be fine. Well, it wasn't. And my neckline has stretched out shockingly. So I did a bit of a fix-it job, and I tried several things. I tried elastic. I tried feeding elastic through the cover hem stitching. Nope, 1/4 inch elastic wouldn't go, too tight. So in the end, I did one more whirl all the way around. And you can see here, I didn't really want to do it on the binding, but nor did I want to do it on the fabric and then have the binding all buckle up. So I did it on the binding, basically as an elastic or a casing for a thread. And because the elastic didn't work, what I did was I got out some black floss, the same floss we've been talking about for the looper. This one's really quite fluffy. And I pulled off a long length of it and put it onto a bodkin, and or a needle that has a blunt tip is fine. And I made it double. And then I doubled the end of it with a knot so that it wouldn't get lost. And then I fed it in through underneath my cover hem stitching on the back, all the way around. And I haven't tied off this yet with a sort of permanent knot because I want to put it on. I only did this morning. I want to put this on and see if it's too tight or too loose or whatever. And then in which case I can pull this up a little bit and make it a little bit better. But I do want to see, will it go over my head or not? Because that's kind of the acid test. All right. And that is a way to fix something if it stretches out. But to prevent stretching out, I should probably have made sure that I put 2 layers of stay tape on the neck edge before and stay tape on my shoulder seams, which I did not do. Of course, I can come back and I can put some twill tape on my shoulder seams to firm those up and stabilize those. But I think I will be a little careful buying bamboo lycra again. I think I'm going to have to hold the fabric before I buy it and give it, you know, the stretch test, because this is really quite stretchy. I think it needs more lycra in the content than bamboo, but the bamboo, of course, does make it really, really soft. Okay, so that is our quick folded necklines and hems and our ribbed necklines, cuffs and hems. And I will meet you back at the machine in a moment, and I will show you a couple more things. Okay, so I thought what I would do is I would cut a pretend neckline of a little top, and I would show you a few things on this. So what I've done is I have fused some white knit stay tape to the bottom edge of this, and I'm going to turn it over and pin it. And it's easier to pin it on the right side. So I'm going to put a big pin in there, and then I'm going to put one somewhere near the middle, and I'm folding it over about the depth of the stay tape. So if you're looking for something that will act as a hem guide for you, yes, sure, most of the brands of sewing machines will carry something called a hem guide for cover hems, and you could purchase that. There will be a learning curve on how to use it, but they're not bad at all. But I have found over the years that using my whoops, I pricked myself, using my pins and my stay tape as a guide for how deep I want my hem, it works quite well for me. Right, so like I said earlier, you could ride the hem along the edge of your needle plate, but that's going to give, it's going to be too close to the fold of my fabric. So I wanted to go over further, and I'm just going to pretty much wing it, except that I don't want to be sewing on the wrong side of the fabric. In other words, where the hem is turned up, unless it is the interlock stitch that I want to see on the outside of the garment. And it might be that that is what I want. If it's something like a Lululemon look that I'm looking for, that may be what I want. But I'm going to start stitching on the right side of the fabric. And I can fortunately see a little ways through this yellow knit. It's a lovely soft buttercup yellow knit. And I can see where my hem is folded up. And I'm going to aim to stitch fairly close to the edge of that. If you can't see through your hem, then what I would do is maybe make little fabric markings, or make yourself some sort of a guide on the bed of the machine, like with painter's tape or something like that. All right, so let's go on down this seam. And I should remember to take my pins out before I get to them, because it's not always a good idea to sew over pins. Now, I want to show you something that is a troubleshooting thing, and I'm hoping that you can see it. Let's get the camera up here. Do you see that I've got like little wrinkles in my hem? That comes because my fabric is being pushed by the presser foot, and sometimes just to raise the presser foot and drop it releases that little wrinkle. Sometimes I need to go to the top of my machine and I need to release my presser foot pressure. I think my presser foot pressure is fairly low at this stage of the game, so I'm going to just hope for the best. All right, and so let me pull this out of the machine. And there we go. All right, it looks a bit odd because I have a white thread that is in my looper. It is not floss. It is just regular white serger thread. And I have, of course, this blue thread that I specifically use, sort of turquoise blue, because I wanted you to be able to see the stitching against the yellow. Not much good if I'd used yellow. All right, so now if you look at this, there's a little bit of a couple of wrinkles on this hem, but I know from experience that that's not bad. If I take this to my ironing board and I spray it with Best Press and press this nicely with my press cloth, it's going to be fine. It's when we've got real twists in the hem that there's not a whole lot you can do other than take that out and do it again. All right, so what we're now going to do is we're going to have a look at the neckline. And I am going to get a piece of red ribbing. And I'm going to fold it over in half, right? And I want wrong sides of the ribbing together. And I'm going to get a few of my clips because we want the right side to be out. Now, if I was doing a garment and I wasn't just basically doing a little demo for you here, I would have measured the neckline and I would have sewn these two edges of my, let's open it out and I'll show you what I would do. I would have taken the two right sides together and put them together like that, and I would have sewn across there with a straight stitch on my sewing machine. And then I would have opened out those seams and pressed them flat so that when this is folded, I wouldn't have that big bunch like we talked about a short while ago. All right, so let me put a little clip in there and a clip over here. Now that I've got this ribbing all clipped together, folded the right way, I am now going to put it on my neckline. Now, obviously, I'm sure you know, when you're doing things on necklines and measuring elastic, and in a sense, ribbing is like elastic. And I'm going to move this camera up a bit so that I'm not bumping it and that you can see more of what I'm doing. Okay, so when you are doing this, you're obviously going to find your quarters. So if this was all being done in the round with the back of the garment, you would find the center of the back and the center of the front, and your shoulder seams may or may not be the center of the sides. So remember that. Sometimes the back is a lot shorter than the front, especially if you have a deep scoop neckline. And so you might find that where you think your quarters are going to be on the shoulder seam actually may not be there at all. All right, so I'm finding the halfway point down the front of my scoop. All right, and that's what I've marked with the pin. And I'm now going to take my ribbing, and this is a polyester ribbing. And what I'm going to do is I am going to put it all the way along my fabric. I could have done this earlier, but I didn't. I was keen to get back to the machine and show you what we're going to do. So here we are. I could have, you know, it's pretty much the right width. I'm just going to cut maybe 1.5 inches off. All right, about 1.5 inches of that ribbing off. And I'm then going to match that up at the top, which is kind of like my pretend shoulder seam. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the ribbing in half, and I'm going to take a pin, and I am going to mark the halfway mark of that ribbing, because obviously that ribbing halfway mark must meet the halfway mark of the garment. And if you were doing it in the round, all your quarters must meet. Now you can see that I have got a little bit of stretching to do here. Not much, because this ribbing is fairly stretchy, but I'm going to make sure that it all fits snugly down on my yellow fabric. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a chain stitch. So I'm going to take one of my needles out. You can't just unthread it and take the and carry on stitching with that needle. Now, not a good idea. So now I have just got the one needle and my looper thread, and I am going to do a straight stitch. This, of course, could be done at my sewing machine, but I am going to run this along. I don't need a very deep seam. 1/4 of an inch is probably quite enough. So if you were at your sewing machine, 1/4 of an inch seam is good. And I'm going to come all the way along here with my chain stitch. It is an alternative to going to your sewing machine for a straight stitch. And as I go, I'm making sure that all my layers are up against each other. In other words, they are even. And I'm coming around to the bottom of my front scoop neckline, and I'm going to take that pin out, and then I'm going to make sure that I pin these as well. My binding is stretched just a little. Right, take that clip out. And a little further, and then we're round to the other pretend shoulder. Okay, and if I go backwards once with my flywheel, but it's not the best of things, because look what happens. It starts to unravel. It starts coming undone. So I'm just going to do it again. And I'm not going to do that method. Okay, I'm just going to lift up and do the pulling method and cut away all these threads, because I always found too many threads in the way are not my favorite thing. I really don't like a lot of mess. All right, so now, as you can see, there is my neckline with its ribbing on. Let's move these things out of the way. And now you can see there is my ribbing. However, it's not lying as flat as I would like. So sure, I'm going to go to my iron, and I'll return to the machine in a moment, and I'm going to press this ribbing downwards. In other words, if you look at it from the back, my ribbing is pressed towards the hemline of my pretend t-shirt. I don't want it to come up towards the neck edge, because that's going to form a very thick ridge there. I want it going downwards. And I don't think I'm going to see red fabric through the yellow fabric, because there is a red fabric a yellow fabric 1/4 of an inch there, which is kind of between it and the ribbing. So I'm going to go and press, and I'm going to put my needle back into the machine, and I'm going to come back and show you how I make ribbing on a little t-shirt lie so beautifully flat. So just a couple of moments and I will be back. Okay, so here we are back at the machine, and I am going to show you the cover hem 2-thread wide that I am going to do around the ribbing and the neckline opening. So I'm doing it in this odd color. If I was doing a t-shirt, let's say, for example, and it happened to be yellow and I happened to use red ribbing, what I would probably do is thread up my right needle with red thread and my left needle with yellow, pale yellow thread. But here I'm just using this teal green or blue color. And I am going to make sure that I'm not watching the needles. If you watch the needles, that's when your neckline is going to look like a drunken sailor passed by. Okay, you need to watch these little marks on the front of your foot. And I am guiding that middle mark as close to the ditch of my yellow and red as I possibly can. All right, so let's go. And that's all I am watching, is that little mark on the foot, and is it going in the ditch of my yellow and red? And I keep going. Go as slow as you think you need to go. You do not need to go fast with this. There's no hurry, because once it's stitched, if it's not stitched evenly, you are going to notice it. and I'm speaking to myself probably more than anybody else as regards that, because I tend to charge at everything and go super fast. Okay, so here I am almost back at my pretend shoulder, and I am going to do that method where I hook out my 2 threads, raise my presser foot, pull the threads out to the front, both of the needle threads out to the front, and then I am going to take my scissors and cut them. And now I'm going to hold quite close to that and just pull. And then what it does is it takes all my threads to the back, and I don't have that unraveling. All right, so now let's have a look at that. Let me move my machine so that I can put it flat on the table. Does that not look really cool? Now, if I took this to the machine and I pressed it some more, that would flatten a bit. But in all honesty, I think that if I had the benefit of hindsight, I would have cut off more than just that. I probably would have cut off double that. I didn't realize that this is actually really quite stretchy ribbing. All right, so there is my little pretend t-shirt. All right, it's got its little ribbing neckline, which probably could have been shorter. The ribbing could have been shorter, and then it would have laid more flat. But the part that I'm really wanting you to see is here where we've done the cover hem at the join of our stitching with the chain stitch. It's beautifully flat. This is a little bit too fluffy, if that's a way to put it. And there we go. There is our cover hem on the back. And of course, we can come by with our trusty sharp scissors, and we can cut away the excess fabric from our seam. Just take very good care that you do not cut your yellow fabric or your stitching. But then that will be much neater. I prefer to do it this way because then I know that I've caught everything in the seams. If you did your stitching too close to the edge of the ribbing so that your cover hem would cover over the ribbing, number one, the one needle would be on only one layer of fabric, and the other needle would be on 4 layers of fabric, and that's guaranteed to give you skipped stitches and puckering. All right, so I prefer to do it on the same level for both needles through the same amount of layers of fabric. And as I say, look at that. It's beautiful. There's no skipped stitches at all. All right, so there is a little ribbed neckline. And you can see on the ones that I did with the self fabric, those dyed fabrics that I showed you earlier, those looked really, really nice as well with self fabric or a contrast bamboo. I think this has got a little bit of bamboo in it, but it's mainly cotton. So there you go. I think what we will do is we will now give you a break. So I will put my little pause video with some music at this point on the video, and you can just pause the video. It runs for about 15 seconds. So just put it on pause, go away, have a bathroom break, get yourself a beverage or whatever it is that you want to do. And when you come back, we'll do more neckline finishes. I've got more to show you. Yes, I do. Okie doke. See you soon. Okay, so what I did was I took this stretch velveteen fabric. It's a stretch knit fabric, but it's got this lovely plush velveteen surface. And I made a binding strip to go along the edge of this sort of slightly rounded edge. So if I put this under the machine, I think you can see that it is curved all the way around the edge. Now, I used a poly spandex fabric that was printed, and I cut it about 2.5 inches wide. Because it is a knit fabric, I established which way was more stretchy than the other, and I cut it along that length of the fabric. Some knit fabrics, it doesn't matter because they're going to stretch much the same way. But on this fabric, it doesn't stretch much that way, but it does stretch a lot more this way. So this would be the way to cut a binding if I was making a binding from the stretch velveteen, which is the most glorious dark regal purple color. So that is what I've got on that side, a single layer binding. And on this side, I think you can see right away how much thicker it is. This is a double layer binding. So we're going to do those one by one. And we're going to do all of it on the cover hem machine. So first of all, I have cut a piece of binding here with a purple colored poly spandex knit. And if I measure this, it is a little over 2.5 inches wide. And obviously you need it to be as long as your opening that you want to bind. And if that requires a join, then go ahead and join. Now you can join straight on like that, but you are going to have a little bit more of a lump if you do that. So when I joined this one, you will see that I did it on the diagonal. I joined that binding at a 45-degree angle, just like we do when we're doing quilt binding. And it is much flatter there. All right, so on this particular piece, I don't have to join. I've got a piece of binding long enough for this kind of pretend neck opening that I've got going with a pink poly spandex fabric. Doesn't have to be polyester. It can be a cotton knit. It can be a bamboo knit. It can be any of those things. Now, what I can do is my needle is over in the left hand position. And I could stitch there. But if I want to stitch not too far from the edge of the fabric, that needle is going to be too far over to the left for me, and it's going to give me quite a lot of seam allowance. I'm not going to worry too much about that in this particular instance, but I mention it because it might be something that you need to consider which needle you use so that your fabric can run along the edge of the two layers. The neckline edge, which is my pale pink, and then this darker wine color, which is the binding. As I say, I'm not going to worry, so I'm just going to lower my presser foot. In fact, what probably might be a good idea is to sew onto my little leader, just so that my fabrics don't bunch up when I start sewing and the stitch has already started forming. And I am going to make sure that my whole foot is over the fabric, because if I put the foot partially off the fabric, the feed dogs are not going to work as efficiently as they would if the whole foot is on the fabric. So I have just put 2 pins, but I could have put more, or I could just wing it. So I'm going to just keep coming around, and you'll notice, you perhaps might not notice it, but I have got the same sort of turquoise thread in, because I want you to be able to see the stitching that I'm doing. If I did it in a sort of dark burgundy wine color here, you wouldn't see it, and then that would be hard for the camera to pick up as well. All right, so here we go. I'm continuing all the way around my neckline. I am not pulling my binding piece very much. I don't want a wrinkly, puckered up neckline. But at the same time, I also don't want a neckline that sort of gapes and is too big. Remember yesterday or earlier, we did the red ribbing on that yellow knit fabric, and it was a little too big. I should have actually had the binding just a little tighter. So there we go. Let's show you. That is our binding stitched down onto the pretend neckline. And there is my simple straight stitch on the top. Looks just like what I would have done it at the sewing machine. But on the back, I have a little chain stitch. And if you happen to make a mistake, that chain stitch where we stopped stitching over here, if I was to start pulling that white thread, it would simply just completely unravel all the way along the seam. I'm not going to worry about that because this would be sewn into a shoulder seam. I'm just showing the neck binding here. So now what we're going to do is we are going to fold our fabric over to the back. And I am actually going to use my fingers to feel if my seam allowance is nice and flat. I can't exactly see it, but I'm going to feel it. I want my binding to go right to the edge where the binding folds over. I don't want there to be an empty space in there, nor do I want my seam allowance to be all buckled and folded inside, because that's going to make a lumpy, bumpy neck edge or binding edge. So I'm going to continue on here, folding. I prefer to do this rather than do it on the fly while I'm sewing. I prefer to do this ahead of time. And you can go to the end and you can fold that over and then come back to the middle. Sometimes I like doing that, and then it kind of spreads the fullness of the sewing if that would need to be done. Here it's not too bad because I have almost stitched the binding at a 1-to-1 ratio with the fabric. And the reason that I probably have chosen to do that is because both of these fabrics are very similar in weight and very similar in stretch value. And so it's always a good thing to consider that before you put your binding on. Now, I know I've got far too much binding at the back, and that is going to pull kind of while I'm stitching, but that doesn't matter because it's not going to be where the stitching is, and I will trim down that seam later. Okay, so I'm now going to bring this up to the edge. Now, here's the trick. If I watch my needle, I may or may not get the stitching in the ditch, and we're aiming for it to be in the ditch between my binding and my little t-shirt neckline. If I watch the needle, it's probably going to hit and miss sometimes. So what we're going to do is that needle is in the far left needle position. So I am going to ride this mark on my foot along that ditch. And I'm not going to worry too much about anything else. I'm just going to watch that as I go. And as I go, I may need to pull my fabric towards me just ever so slightly to keep it all nice and flat as I sew. So watch that little marking on the ditch there and flatten the fabric gently as you go. And like I said on the previous exercise, go slowly, because if you try and do this too fast, this is when you're going to miss that ditch. And yes, we're using a turquoise thread. If we were using a pale pink or a wine colored thread, it probably would not show as much as this turquoise thread. But I've already explained why I wanted to use a turquoise thread. So I'm just going to take all the pins out so they don't poke me, because I regularly poke myself with pins. I read a horror story on Facebook yesterday about a lady who was saying, please, ladies, be careful. I don't know, you might have seen it if you troll Facebook as much as I do. She managed, I don't know quite how, but she managed to stab herself by about to a depth of about 1.5 inches with her Kai scissors. Like I say, I can't even picture how she did that. And of course, she hit an artery. And so she was pumping blood, and she had to, you know, put towels on it and press on it and phone 911. All was well that ended well, but it could have been disastrous. So if you think you might stab yourself with your Kai scissors, do be careful, ladies. I've never managed to do that. Yes, I've managed to sew over my fingers, and yes, I have managed to prick myself with my pins, but I haven't quite managed to stab myself yet. Hopefully not ever. So now this is the back of my binding, and it is folded over nicely, but obviously I have got too much. And I said to you, we started with just over 2.5 inches. We could have started with 2 inches. All right, I still would have had quite a bit of fabric to cut off. And I am now going to cut my binding back to somewhere around 1/8 of an inch away. It could even be 1/16 of an inch away from my chain stitching. In other words, fairly close to the stitching. And oh my goodness, look what I managed to do. That was a silly thing. I may not have stabbed myself with my scissors, but I managed to cut the fabric underneath. So you, of course, are not going to do that. You're not going to be that silly. But I can't tell you how often it happens. All right. So there we have our beautiful neckline with its little cut, courtesy of Liz's stupidity. You can see over there, I didn't keep to my ditch there. So what you could do if this bothered you is you could unpick that section and you could redo it. All right. And then continue around. Okay, apparently I took a little break a couple of times and wasn't watching the mark on my foot. And so I have come a little bit away from the ditch. However, bear in mind that if I had been using a pale pink thread, that really wouldn't have been nearly as noticeable as it is with that turquoise thread. And then, of course, on the back, all we see is this neat chain stitch. And I actually think that if I was going, this was a garment of mine, I think I would like to trim that fabric a little closer. Okay, so I would like to trim it a little closer like that and try and make it even. It's not very even there. It looks like somebody's been chewing it, but you get the idea. So that is what we call a single layer binding. And I have not yet taken it to the ironing board to press that, but I would press it with my nice silk organza pressing cloth. And that would be a very nice, neat, flat neck edge. All done with my cover hem machine on the chain stitch. All right. Obviously, I could have come by and let's do that because we can. All right. So I'm going to get a needle and I'm going to put a second needle into the machine and find my little screwdriver and tighten the needle on that. And then here is my other needle thread, which I am going to bring down and thread that needle with that. I always like to cut the edge of my thread before I try and put it into the needle because it usually goes in first time. Whereas if it's all fluffy and who knows what, then it doesn't always behave. All right, so I did a chain stitch, but we could just as easily have done a 2-thread or a 3-thread even. All right, so I'm going to come along here. And now the trick is to take the very middle slot and ride that along the ditch so that my 2 needles either side will then be straddling the ditch. I'm getting up to where my little hole is that I cut in the fabric. All right, I'm just going to go that far, and then I do need to hold this carefully because it wants to unravel when I pull it out of the machine like that. And there is another option. Okay, it looks quite good over there. And let's just zero in on that. Here, of course, you can see the stitch where I went a little bit skew with the chain stitching. Now I have got a 2-thread narrow and the stitching is on the binding and on the pink fabric. And then on the back, of course, that's what it looks like with the cover hemming. So you've got a choice. Doesn't have to be chain stitch. It can also be one of your other cover hem stitches. So that is the single layer binding. Now what I'd like to do is show you the double layer binding. So I will be back in a moment with those prepared samples. Okay, so now I've got that same fabric we used for the binding last time. This is now my little pretend neck opening or armhole opening. And I have a piece of quilting cotton here. It's a pink color, bright pink color. And I have cut myself a strip that is about 2.5 inches wide. Probably doesn't need to be that wide, but I'm going to do it that wide for now. All right. And I am going to lay this. Actually, what I want to do is fold this over. All right. And do it double. That way we won't have to worry about ending off the seam inside. All right, so I'm going to start stitching my chain stitch. So I took the needle out, the second needle that we put in a moment ago, and I am now stitching down this fabric equidistant from the edge of the fabric, round about 1/4 inch or slightly more. And this fabric was cut on the bias because it is a cotton fabric. It's a woven, it's not a knit. So I just wanted to show you that you can sew bindings onto your garments that are not knit bindings. All right, so let's take that out and pull it through, cut our threads off, and cut the excess binding off. Okay, so here we have our fabric that has been stitched on, and what we're going to do is we're going to fold that over to the back, but this is now a double layer of fabric. Okay, it was a single layer that we used in our previous sample. All right, that was a single layer that we laid on there and then flipped it over. So now what we're going to do is this is going to be double layer, and we're going to simply flip it over to the back, and we are going to pin it. Once again, I like to do this because I can feel with my fingers whether my seam allowance inside is laying flat or whether it's all buckled up, all right, or whether I've got an empty patch towards the edge of the binding. All right, so now we're going to come back and we are going to stitch this with the chain stitch again. And I'm going to put that down. Decide what you're going to look at on the foot, the marking. And I've decided that I'm following the marking that corresponds to the needle, but I'm running it just above the ditch, or just to the right-hand side of the ditch. And then hopefully it will be exactly where I want it to be the whole way along my binding. Right. And there we go. We have our binding done really quite nicely. All right. It's very smooth. It is not a knit fabric, so it probably will hold that neck edge of your knit fabric a little better than a knit fabric would. So I think next time I make a nightgown or something with my bamboo knit, which has stretched out quite a lot with its knit binding, I think what I'm going to do is use a woven fabric binding for my neckline. And I think that my nightie will kind of last a little bit longer. Well, the neckline will last a little bit longer before it stretches out. Now, you'll notice that my stitching is a fair distance away from the folded edge. All right. If my fabric had been a little narrower, in other words, not 2.5 inches, let's say it had been 2 inches, then this stitching would have been dead right. So when it's all said and done, I probably should have stitched just to the left of the ditch of my binding. So I'm just going to put another one down, and I have a suspicion that I might actually have fallen off. No, I did not. All right, so you can see now the second row is closer to the edge of the binding. So you might want to consider that when you think about the placement of your stitching. And of course, you could come by and this could be a 2-thread cover hem and not a chain stitch as you stitch it down. And the fact that it's a chain stitch or a 2-thread gives you a bit of stretch to that fabric, even though the fabric is a woven. But we cut it on the bias. I would not cut it on the straight unless it was, let's say, for a cuff. And we know that the cuff it's not got a curve to follow. All right, it's just going to be straight round with the cuff. That would probably be okay to have the fabric on the cross grain of the fabric. However, do bear in mind that the fabric will not stretch very much if you don't cut it on the bias. So if you're wanting to put your hand through a fairly tight cuff, all right, then I would think about doing it on the bias. But if your sleeve or your cuff around your wrist or further up your arm is a little wider and there's room for your hand to come through, then it doesn't really matter. You could cut it on the cross grain. Okay, so there we have a double layer binding, but done with a woven fabric. So now let's have a look at the next one that I want to show you with a double layer of knit fabric. Very similar, but we'll whip through that quickly because I want you to see that as well. Right, so here I have some gray poly spandex knit fabric, and I have some lovely soft pink cotton knit binding. And I cut the binding. I do believe it was about I cut the binding about 2.5 inches. You could make it slightly narrower if you wish, but sometimes that can be a bit fiddly, as we discussed a moment ago. And I also want you to note that I did not join this binding at a 45-degree angle. I joined this straight across, but I gave it a generous 1/2 inch. Yep, that's pretty much 1/2 inch seam, not 1/4 inch. So it lies nice and flat when it is pressed. So I have pressed that, and I have pressed the whole binding over in half. And I'm now going to start stitching my chain stitch. And I'm just riding the foot of the machine alongside the layers, the raw edge layers of my opening. And there, as I say, this could be a neck opening. This could be an armhole. This could be a cuff. It could be a hemline if you want to add a binding around a hemline. Well, why would I want to do that? Well, maybe I'm making a jacket and I want a little bit of a binding on the bottom of my jacket. All right, so there is my chain stitching, and obviously on the back there is my little chain stitching that gets formed with a little loop. All right, so the next thing I would do is I would go to the iron and I would fold this over, and we've got quite a deep hem here because I rode the edges of the fabric along the side of the ruler. So let me just measure this here. All right, let's just see. I have got a 3/8 of an inch hem here. No, I have a 1/2 inch hem here. So that's why if we now come to turn this over like this, I haven't actually got enough fabric to deal with. So probably if I was going to make a 1/2 inch seam, I would have needed to have my fabric, binding fabric, a little wider. So what I'm going to do is I am going to cut this down to about, give or take, 1/4 of an inch. Okay, let's raise my presser foot. That's acting as my other hand. And let's put it over there and continue cutting my binding a little narrower. This, you will notice, it's not an overly thick knit fabric, and certainly this fabric is not overly thick. I would call them both light to medium weight knits. And you will see, and I think you'll appreciate, that it is actually quite thick here. So what we're going to do, like I've done with the others, is I'm turning that over and I am making sure that I can feel through that turnover that everything is lying flat. All right, that's what it looks like on that side, and that's what it looks like on this side. So I'm going to put a couple of pins in as I go along. I'll put one in the middle here. And I will put one at the end. I may need, because this is quite thick and the binding has ended up being quite narrow because of the binding being only 2.5 inches. It's probably better to be 3 or maybe even 3.5 inches. And there we go. I'll put one more pin here. Right, back to the machine. Let's make sure that I have got my threads. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the needle back into the machine. And this time I'm going to put it back into the machine at the 2 thread wide. So I've got my needle in the left-hand position and I have the other needle in the far right needle position. And I'm just going to thread up that needle quickly. Always, if you don't snip the end, it doesn't want to go through the eye. It wants to fluff and misbehave. There we go. Always works when you cut it. Right. So what I am going to aim for now is I've got a 2 thread wide, and you've got options, of course, but I am going to, this is quite thick, so I'm having a little bit of difficulty getting it underneath my foot. There we go, and I'll pull it backwards. What I'm going to do with my 2 needles is I am going to aim for the marking on the foot that is in the middle. In other words, where the middle needle would be. That is what I'm going to ride along the ditch between my gray and my pink fabric. And I'm going to do my 2 thread wide on this binding. All right, let's take that pin out. That is where my join is, in the middle of the binding. If you were doing something and you had thicker fabrics than what I'm working with, and you wanted to use the, where is it? You wanted to use this little hump jumper to go over that middle join or any joins you may have in your binding, feel free to stop and do that. All right, and I'm going to do the little method where we pull the threads out and cut them and pull the thread easily out of the machine. All right, so now you don't see the one stitch very well because it's the teal on the gray, but you can see it on the pink. And then there, oh, look at all the skip stitching. Really don't like that very much. And it's because we're dealing with thick fabrics. So this is why I highly recommend that whenever you're doing a new technique, that what you do is you do a test. So this could have been my test And I could have said, well, you know, I really don't like that. All right. It was quite fine at the end, and it was not bad at the beginning, and then it started skipping. All right. So then that's when I would go into the troubleshooting that I talked at quite a lot of detail for in part 1 of our Coverhemming series. And so I would start making adjustments to my settings on the machine to see if I can get rid of those puckering and, well, it's actually more skipped stitches than anything else. And it's because it is quite thick. When we get to putting using the tape binder to put binding on the edges, it's going to be even more of a trick to not get skipped stitches there. So obviously this would need some tweaking, and I'm glad that it showed up like this, because it would be no good if everything I showed you was just perfect and beautiful, and then you start sewing at home and you're getting things that look like that. You're going to be very mad and say, well, what did Liz not tell me? All right, skipped stitches are unfortunately a fact of life with Coverhemming machines. And so like I said in the first part, there are things that you can try, and I definitely like to try them one by one. So here, what I would probably do is I would, the options, I could switch up my differential feed a bit, because maybe it's not feeding through properly. I could also, on the top of my machine, loosen my presser foot pressure. Then I could also loosen my looper tension. And I'm actually going to just do that. I haven't done any of the other things. I am going to loosen my looper tension. And I wonder if we just stitch. Yes, let's just stitch from the other side so we don't get confused which one is which. And I am going to come and stitch over here along the same thickness of fabric that we dealt with earlier, and see if lowering my looper tension has made a difference. All right, let's just trim these needle thread tails off. And I'm going to come a little further and then take my sewing out of the machine. And yes, it's a lot better. I didn't exactly go straight. I did the drunken sailor thing, but it is looking pretty good. I do notice that my left needle is getting pulled down to the back in a couple of spots, because I'm seeing a little bit too much of the turquoise thread here. So what I would probably also do is check that there's nothing that's obstructing my needle thread. And I would tweak with that a little until I got stitches forming that I was happy with. But I had it on 3 for my looper tension, and I lowered that to 1. I can't really go much further than that. But I would say if I'm on looper tension 1 and I'm still getting the turquoise fabric coming through every so often, that would probably be something's catching on something else, not the tension disc. All right, so there we go. Not my most favorite kind of binding because it is quite thick. I actually much prefer the binding that is done on a single layer, all right, like this one here. It gives a much flatter and a flatter look, and I do prefer that. All right, here we've also got the binding, double binding, and it is pretty thick. Okay, a couple of ways that we can finish necklines on our garment sewing with our Coverhemming. And so we looked at probably one of my go-to methods is the quick folded neckline. And you can use that for armholes and hems as well, where you simply turn the fabric over and stitch it down with a Coverhemming. And that can be chain stitch, 2 threads narrow, 2 thread wide, or triple cover hem, whatever look you want on the neckline or other finished edge of your garment. And then we looked at achieving neat, flat edges or finished neck edges using ribbing or a self-binding of the fabric from the garment. And that could be the same fabric as the garment, or it could be a contrasting fabric, but around about the same weight.